So a very quick introduction for those of you who are less familiar with the WFA. Hopefully most of you are. Now, what we do, we focus on delivering better marketing. That's what we do. We do that for over 90 client-side marketing organizations, and we do this in various ways, but much of our work is underpinned by the principle of crowdsourcing solutions from within our growing network of clients. And my role, I'm Matt, I'm in the middle there. My role is to provide support, guidance and best practices within the areas of media and digital in particular. And today I'm also joined by Natalia on the right. Natalia has the enviable title of Knowledge Manager at WFA. And if you want any knowledge, please do get in touch with Natalia, and I'm sure she'll be able to help you. Then we also have the incomparable Mike Shaw from dataxu with us today. And Mike is going to be telling us all about dataxu's vision for the future of programmatic, incorporating findings from our report. And Mike's going to pepper that with actions for you all as well. Before we hand over, some brief context. Now, we at WFA, we've been watching with interest as programmatic has unfolded over the past few years. In 2016, 2017, we saw the diversification of programmatic models. As you can see with this slide here, agency trading desks remain steady in terms of share of respondents to this survey. However, we've seen the growth of alternative models, independent trading desks, in-house, brand trading, hybrid, quite often concurrently with other models. That's why these numbers add up to above 100%. I think that's really interesting. It is becoming more common for brands to manage some, just maybe some, a little of their programmatic in-house, whilst also utilizing agencies and other technology partners for the heavy lifting. We're seeing more of that. But it's worth pointing out that the bars on the far right, where you see that 21%, that is a combination of the brand, the in-house trading desk, and the hybrid, two different things in there today. But the point is that as Bob Dylan famously said, hence the reference, the times they are a-changing, right? So I think for me, hybrid models make quite a lot of sense. You know, it's all about choosing the technology that you want, contracting directly with the technology vendors that you want, and then selecting the agency partners to operationalize that. That, for me, makes quite a lot of sense, and we've seen a lot of members making that decision. What else? Well, we've seen the strong growth of the disclosed model. So programmatic models in the past have been somewhat less visible. Today, we're seeing much more disclosure happening here, so advertisers actively seeking out visibility of media pricing and trading terms. Much more of those going on. And probably one of the biggest themes we saw in our communities in 2017 was the establishment of whitelists and blacklists, as clients sought out to exert more control over where their ads were appearing, especially in the wake of the brand safety fallouts, which happened in both sort of Q1 and Q4 of 2017. So lots going on within this space, but what's next? What is next? And that is what we intended to shine a bit of a spotlight on within this document, which I referenced earlier, the future of programmatic. And we just put that out, and as I say, we're going to make that available to you post the call. And yeah, the intention of it was to find out what your spend intentions were and what your priorities were for the future. And you know, the industry is awash with sort of references of blockchain and AI right now, and those are future priorities, no doubt. But actually, we saw that for many of our members, the priorities were potentially more grounded in the sort of practical day-to-day. So you'll see all that in due course. But actually, what we thought would be interesting at this point in time would be to introduce a little bit of interactivity to the webinar. So what you're about to see is a poll. We're going to put a quick straw poll up, and we'd like to ask you, well, what is your biggest focus area for programmatic in 2018, 2019? And this kind of links to the survey, which Mike will speak to in a minute. But we'd be really interested to get your thoughts on what your biggest focus area is for programmatic. Is it going to be the GDPR, big issue for many people? Is it attribution? Is it capability, internal client-side capability? Or is it agency/technology partners, outsourcing? Is it new programmatic channels altogether? For example, advanced TV, programmatic TV, digital at home, is it something like that? Or is it something else altogether? Is it none of the above? Because there are clearly many other priorities that you could be focused on. But if you can put your vote in here, you should see all those options in front of you right now. GDPR, attribution, capability, partners, new channels. Make your choice. And we're seeing those come in now. Quite interesting, actually. And this is particularly interesting because we did this webinar this morning, earlier on, and we saw some quite different results to what I'm seeing right now. So right now, I think it looks like we've got a number of people who have voted. Natalia, should we broadcast these now? Should we stick them up? Okay. So we can see that the biggest share of prioritizing GDPR, that is the biggest focus for you guys on the call today. Closely followed, I should say, by agency or technology partners. So it's about regulation, it's about partners. Those are the biggest things. That is interesting because earlier on it was very much focused on the partner piece. Now it's more nuanced, isn't it? It's more split between that and regulation, and that makes a lot of sense to me. I can understand why it would go down like that. So Mike, what did you think of that?
It is really interesting to see that the organisational part of the poll has really been trumped by GDPR on this one. GDPR was certainly popular last time, but even in the 4 hours nearer the deadline that we have, it's managed to gain about 10 percentage points. So that race will be top of mind by everybody by close of business.
All right, great. Well, I'm going to hand over to you now, Mike. So tell us about the future of programmatic. One last thing, everybody on the call, you will see a chat widget and a Q&A widget on your screen, I hope. Please do feel free to stick chat and Q&A into those widgets. We'll have a couple of minutes at the end to deal with questions for Mike, so please do take advantage of that. Over to you, Mike. Thank you.
Matt, thank you very much. Natalia, thank you very much for setting this up. Good afternoon, everybody. As Matt said, my name's Mike Shaw, and I'm the VP for Europe here at dataxu. For those of you who may not be familiar with dataxu, we are a technology partner for agencies and advertisers, essentially a route to programmatic advertising for both parts of the ecosystem. And my role today is really over the next half an hour or so to take you through the future of programmatic media as we see it, from using the perspectives of both our clients and both the advertiser and agency side, but also the insights we've gained from that piece of research with WFA around the priorities for both the near and longer term future. And I'd really like to frame this in the following way. A few minutes really on measurement, which didn't do too well on that poll in terms of things people are thinking about, so maybe it's indicative of the fact that people already believe they've got it nailed, or maybe what we'll show will actually open the eyes of a few people around some of the issues that are caused by the way that we look at success in programmatic. And secondly, this idea of the audiences that are being targeted, and just some thoughts around how brands might think differently about some of the tactics employed at campaign levels. And then we want to really go into what people have been looking at recently, let's call it 2017, what seems to be on people's plates right now, largely around data and identity, and then we'll go further forward into the future in terms of formats, buying models, and doubtless things like AI will come up in there as well. As Matt said, please do take the time as you go through this to populate that questions box. We'll come on to all of those at the end, so forgive me if I don't interrupt in the next 20 minutes or so to take each one in turn. So, the first point on this that I really wanted to address is this idea of time horizons. Digital media has the benefit through mechanisms like the response options available to be seen generally as quite a short-term, quite a direct response, quite an immediate media versus more traditional forms like print, like out-of-home, like television, which have never had that time horizon in terms of measurement laid upon them. And I think that we think that's got some dangers. So there's a few things that we wanted to just highlight here. One of them, this is going back to Peter Drucker, looking at this idea of long-term results not being able to be achieved by piling short-term results on short-term results. This notion that actually, if we want long-term success, then fundamentally we have to think for the long term, rather than necessarily continually on a campaign-by-campaign basis in the short term. That's not a unique piece of thinking, and not necessarily a whole new truth for the people on this call, but it's interesting because it crops up again as a theme in the preface to a book, The Long and Short of It, by Binet and Field, which is a big analysis of the IPA data bank, those successful campaigns and what makes them so. And Neil talks about the major threat being that the use of short-term metrics damages long-term brand profitability. These things that might seem a very good idea and might seem like they're adding value in the days and weeks of a campaign aren't necessarily the best for the overall brand equity in the long term. And in fact, this was backed up by one of the WFA members when we were asking for opinions within the research we've just conducted, talking about being absolutely crystal clear on why people are using programmatic. What is the objectives and how does it fit with the fundamental principles that the advertisers have? And this is really interesting because if you ever see one of the post-campaign analysis or a campaign optimization workflow for any of the people involved, either within your own advertiser organizations or within your agency partners, one of the metrics that's typically looked at first will be click-through rate. And digital, as I said before, has been guilty of using a plethora of measures because it has the technology to employ them, to measure them, track them and report on them in a way that other media can't, but that aren't necessarily linked to overall business success. And if we dive back nearly 10 years now into one of the seminal pieces of work, in this case by Comscore, an advertising quality vendor, really looking to understand this metric of clicks and the extent to which it was indicative of campaign success, what we find is that actually there isn't a link between clicks and business success overall. So on the left-hand side, rather than looking at click-through rates, which typically happen in the half a minute, around 30 seconds, that the average display ad is visible to a consumer, Comscore looked at exposed versus unexposed consumers and the extent to which a measure of success for the advertiser, in this case advertiser site reach, but there was also branded search term usage as well. In this case, advertiser site reach actually climbs and continues to climb in between weeks 1 and 2, 2 and 3, 3 and 4 after exposure, showing that actually digital media overall is working in the same way as traditional advertising. It's building this brand equity, brand awareness, and it is causing people to then go and interact with that brand, just not in a way that can be measured by click-through rate. And worse still, if we have a look on the right-hand side, a further study conducted in 2007 and then reviewed again in 2009 to understand changes and published in the Journal of Advertising Research, what we can see is that actually clickers, the people who click on any display ad unit whatsoever, and to give you an idea, these days the average internet consumer who is what would be called a heavy user, the top fifth users of digital media, will be exposed to in excess of 10,000 ad units in any given month. Given targeting, that's a lot of opportunities to click on things that should be relevant to you. What we end up seeing in the UK is that actually more than 80% of people don't click on anything at all. So that, when you're looking at click-through rate, you're actually measuring the behaviour of a very small number of consumers out of the total group, irrespective of whether that ad has been targeted very well or not. And then the Pareto rule also applies on this, because heavy clickers, the people who click the most, account for a vast majority of the total clicks that are out there. And so it tells me that click-through rate is not a very good barometer of campaign success if we accept the premise that we should be thinking about the long-term equity of our brands and of our organisations overall. So if that is a cautionary tale about what we shouldn't be doing, what are the things that we should be doing? So let's have a look at programmatic, but through the eyes of what we're showing here, a full funnel strategy. Rather than just concentrating on the very end of the funnel, how can we start to use programmatic more broadly to efficiently achieve our objectives that we have further up the funnel as well? For any of you familiar with the work of Byron Sharp and the Ehrenberg Bass Institute, this won't be news. But in the How Brands Grow book from a few years ago, Byron Sharp really highlighted this idea of sales growth not coming from the relentless targeting of a specific segment of a brand's audience, notably the existing buyers, and that actually this is a very good way to long-term decline. One of the interesting pieces in that book was really the study showing that even amongst the loyal buyers of your brand, in any given segment, they will typically only devote around a third of the share of wallet for that segment to your brand or organisation. Two-thirds of it still goes elsewhere, even amongst loyalists. So with that premise in mind, actually continuing to try and milk the loyalists is not that great a strategy versus this idea of trying to bring in new category buyers, in fact new people to the category overall, into the top of the funnel instead. Going back to that work from the IPA effectiveness, the IPA data bank, and again from the Journal of Advertising Research a while ago, Les Binet and Peter Field's work showed that campaigns focused on customer acquisition are far more effective than those that are focusing purely on customer retention or loyalty. And so it lends weight to this idea that actually we need to move away from purely those very significant proportions of total spend that are spent on retargeting, for example, in digital tactics, to actually things where programmatic can help achieve those broader aims further up the funnel. So let's have a look at what that looks like. In this example, orange represents all of the consumers in any given market. If we skip forward, we have a subset of that who are identified as category buyers. These are people who are or have in the past purchased a product or products within that category. And finally, we have a smaller subset of that who we believe are in market right now. With all of the data out there, both your own first-party data and partner data, so third-party signals, we have indications that these category buyers are in market again for a product or service. And what typically happens in terms of digital marketing, and especially programmatic, is that it's this group indicated by the yellow colouring, those in-market buyers who are really being pounced upon and hit continually with messages in order to try and sway that final purchase decision for a given brand. And actually, when we look at the way that marketers will typically think, first off in a digital and programmatic world, we have this idea that somehow the orange group is waste, and I put a question mark there, I'll talk about that in a second. That the blue group is prospecting. These are people we'd like to get our message to, but it's not quite as valuable as the retargeting, the people who are in market that we see the buying signals from right now that we've got the opportunity to try and get to. Now, fundamentally, there's so much focus on this group that actually, when we think about the experience they get as they get very close to the end of the funnel, it's not a great one, and the opportunities to hit those guys are getting more and more expensive as they get further down the journey. Better to have actually gone through more of that idea of prospecting and seeded the brand value, which may well make people less price sensitive, more brand conscious by the time they get down to that end point. And I put this idea of waste with a question mark afterwards because fundamentally there is not necessarily a common acceptance that getting a brand out in front of people that you may not know yet are category buyers, but who either are, just the incomplete data set we're working with doesn't allow us to see it, or who may well be in future. Think about the automotive market for various stages of consumers' development as they grow older, acquire driving license and the income to actually buy. That means that there is a very positive view here that actually this isn't wasted. It's just about the time horizon that you're measuring that would frame it as such. It was summarised really well by one of the WFA members again in one of the quote options we gave for the survey, when they talked about this idea of a programmatic mindset. And having the overall organisation, not necessarily just the programmatic marketers or the marketing team in general, buy into the nature of the way that programmatic can be used to help advertisers. And what that means is it's not just about, again, that digital team, it's all about the other channels as well, TV, out of home, print, understanding this. And it's also about helping the support functions to get their heads around the new models. We'll come on to some of the questions raised in that poll around partnerships or in-housing, etc. But this really means working with your legal teams, working with the accounting and procurement organisations, and research and insights, being able to deal with new metrics such as viewability, fraud, brand safety, etc. Excuse me. So let's talk about exactly how that's working right now within WFA member organisations. As I said at the start, we're going to look at this really through the lens of what was happening last year, what's really top of mind right now, and then what's happening as we move into the future. And if we look at last year, one of the biggest things that hit, and there's no doubt work streams that's going on within all of your organisations, if you're not fortunate enough to be in the minority who believe they're already done, it is really around reaction to and readiness for GDPR. So the General Data Privacy Regulation comes into force towards the end of May this year, and it essentially lays down a number of different standards that organisations need to adhere to in their use of and their application of customer data. Not only that, it will have implications for the way that you deal with partners and the way that you deal with your supply chain in the advertising ecosystem. So it's incredibly important, made so even more by the punitive nature of the fines that are available for imposition in the event of breach of that. And I think when we looked at the survey results, one of the things we were really interested to see is that actually only 10% of marketers feel that they're already prepared for GDPR. I think part of that is the fact that at the time we ran the poll, it was still 6 months to go until the deadline. I think another part of that is actually the lack of complete black and white clarity on what GDPR compliance really looks like. What does having active consent really mean in terms of consumer data opt-in and its subsequent use cases? But I think one of the things it also means is there's a lot of organisations with a lot of work to do right now. So the interesting part is what does that work stream look like? Well, dataxu as an advertising technology vendor are certainly part of the GDPR readiness exercise, and we've worked with our legal team to really look at the types of progress organisations should be making. So if you're not already either part of these work streams or this is something that is embryonic within your own organisations, here are a few things that you might want to be making sure are really in play already. The first one is really around data mapping and understanding where customer data lives in the organisation, how it's stored, and what the use cases are. Because until really that audit has been complete, actually you're not going to be able to properly understand the extent to which the strategic requirements have been achieved. Secondly, and this really underpins a number of people's view that GDPR, whilst a tough hurdle to get over now, could actually stand us in far better stead for dealing with consumers moving forward, and that is by embedding good consumer experiences through privacy by design. Actually building programs where privacy is fundamental and is integrated into product development, is integrated into the way marketing gather and use data, the way that sales are able to apply that data to raise revenues, all of this done within a consumer-centric and consumer-sensitive framework is no bad thing in the long term. This idea of strategic partnerships, and we'll come on to more of this when we have a look at the programmatic models, is key, because the data flows for the vast majority of advertisers will continue to go through a number of parties as well. Typically, as we saw in the WFA data, and we're looking at the trend data, agency trading desks, for example, are a really good view, and the high usage of them is a good view that actually your data is often being used by your agencies on your behalf in order to be able to target media. And the use case and the use rate there was typically still in the 70 to 80% range, even through the different survey timeframes of 2013, 15 and 16. So there are very strategic partnerships that people have in place where this data goes to, and ensuring that those partners are on board in terms of the care and attention that they take with that data that you let them have, and whether they're in fact able to use it in the first instance is key. The policy updating is a hygiene factor, but it's one of those things that actually, based on the extent and the remit of GDPR, there are a lot of policies that this actually affects. And so making sure that full audit has been done, the legal team are on top of not just the customer-facing policies around the use of the site, etc., but actually everything in terms of maybe offers, rewards, membership schemes, loyalty programs, etc., etc., etc. Really fully have that full data mapping exercise, you'll be able to understand what the policy implications are. And finally, this idea of product development. Often product roadmaps are not short things, and actually be able to go into the product roadmap as it stands now and look at what is being captured in terms of consumer data, where it's being surfaced, any opt-out provisions that are already being made available in B2C facing applications, and ensuring the GDPR compliance of all of those may well save either product delays or product non-compliance moving forward. So these are all the types of things that, if they haven't been sorted in the last few months, certainly will need to be getting towards the top of WFA member to-do lists before May the 25th. Now, we talked about partnerships. One of the things, and this is actually something that came up as one of the hottest topics this morning in the poll, just hitting GDPR, and it was this idea of whether or not the programmatic activity ought to be in-house by brands, or whether there ought to be a different model instead. In the case of this morning's poll, around 58% were wrangling with either the upskilling of internal teams or with agency and technology partners. That, I think, was around 41-42% in the poll that we've just done. When we ran the research in Q4 of last year, what we saw was that 15% of advertisers are now spending more than 50% of their global digital budget on programmatic. And so it means that this is now something that's really fundamental to consciously get right about the way that you go to market, because there is now so much at stake. It goes back to that quote from one of the WFA members that we saw beforehand about this idea of an organisational programmatic mindset in the event that you are going to bring it in. Interestingly, two results from the study that we didn't show here are that 74% of those polled are upskilling existing teams around programmatic, not necessarily meaning it's all going in-house, but certainly that the organisations themselves need to be more savvy in this area. And 48% of respondent organisations are actually getting new skills in externally. So when we have a look at this partnership model, and if you are bringing things in-house, typically there is a skills gap between what exists in a more traditional marketing organisation within the average WFA member versus what needs to be in order to be successful in programmatic in the long term. So let's have a look at some of the considerations that we believe should be at the fore of decision making around the right model for you. And I think the key as we lay these out is to say that there is no one right answer. There are a number of dependencies we're going to lay out here, and it's really going to be a horses for courses choice but should be one made consciously with all of these in mind about the model that fundamentally gets adopted. So there's 6 key areas that we want to have a look at. First off is really around budgets and the extent to which this is an issue for you as an advertiser. In the event programmatic budgets are small, it's probably not something you need to focus on in-house. Partners can take care of it, the risk is lower, and actually upskilling significantly for a very small proportion of your total spend doesn't make a huge amount of sense. Likewise for timing, frequent short duration campaigns take a lot more management time, and again this may well be something that agencies are better skilled to manage on your behalf. We look at tactics. Again, there is a wide gamut of complexity about the campaigns that we see running in programmatic ecosystems. Some of them are very broad, large amounts of spend in single sets of tactics and objectives. Other ones very fragmented, very, very granular, niche tactics applied under the auspice of an overall campaign umbrella. Again, if you start to look at these in isolation, it's really going to come back to that spend level about the extent to which this is worth your time versus partnering with people who used it before. Again, to the point on the Q&A, we'll come back to all of these towards the end of it. So the question about budget, we'll hold that one for a second. We will come back at the end. Targeting is next, and this idea of complex targeting, we've used a US example of the DMAs, so regions in the States, 100 separate DMA-specific budgets, and this is not an obtuse example. There are a number of these already running on the dataxu platform. These take up a huge amount of time, and again, there may well be partners that you have that are better prepared and better skilled in order to run those and optimize each of those flights on your behalf. The geographic point is really interesting. A number of WFA members, and it became apparent when we presented in the end of November over in Amsterdam, a number of WFA members do outsource their programmatic activity, but some of the measurement of those and the strategy for it remains in-house. And one of the themes that was a pain point was this idea of getting cross-border comparable results and really understanding is it the market nuance or something else about the campaign that's causing this disparity, this range in the results that's being achieved. And we definitely would advise having local expertise involved rather than this regional view in order to genuinely understand whether or not the results in Spain and the UK and France and Germany are actually good in their own merits rather than trying to look at a regional benchmark instead. And finally, this idea of partner management. I think one of the reasons in the poll this morning that the third party and partner piece came up so much is that there is a recognition of the requirement, much like technology companies and more traditional media organizations do, really managing the partner ecosystem and actively doing that rather than simply having a piece of technology in your organization or an agency. That active partner management and making sure that performance is monitored, that expectations are clear, that roadmaps are developed, followed, executed upon, and that learnings are embedded for future actions, does take time, does take expertise, and maybe for a number of organisations actually that's a better place for time within the advertiser, leaving the execution to trusted partners. But we'll come more onto the models in a little bit. But this idea of programmatic in-house is doubtless one that will have been a decision, if not taken, and certainly being thought about at length within your organisations. One of the models that we are looking at a lot, and we see actually in a number of cases where programmatic activity is most successful for people working across the dataxu platform, is this idea of a shared risk model with partners. So the brand setting the overall marketing strategy and objectives, then employing the agencies for the campaign strategy themselves, the media planning, and then the tactical execution of campaigns, optimization of that, continual reinforcing of the learnings and communication back with the brand. and the programmatic partner, so a technology player, then actually being the software used to make those media buys, to optimize the campaigns, to work on some of the things that we'll look at shortly in terms of what's happening right now around frequency capping. And the third part of this triangle is really the data flow. We've characterized it here as DMP, the data management platform. But all of this success in this model is predicated upon the successful transfer of data and then utilization of data at the point of decisioning around media buying. Really having data-led decisions on what to buy and at what price, based on an understanding of who that's about to be served to or not, their interests, their actions, their previous exposure to the brand, etc. So this is one of this shared risk model is one of the models out there. There's also kind of own and control, generally bringing everything in-house. There's an outcomes and performance model about the way that you work in more or a different structure with partners, and then this platform or self-serve model. And to the point made by Matt at the very outset of this, there's a number of supporting materials you'll get after this call, this deck being one of them, but there's also a white paper explaining those four models on the Data2 site that we can make sure is provided as well. So if that's what's been happening, what's happening right now? And I want to focus a lot here around this idea of identity. Identity graphs are not something that typically marketers are thinking a huge amount about, but actually anybody who was reading some of the press a couple of days ago will have seen a quote from P&G's CFO as part of their kind of war against waste within the digital ecosystem. They'd started really looking at viewability and fraud levels, and one of the new areas called out by John Muller was actually now around the waste caused by not being able to frequency cap across multiple devices. And actually the technology to do that now exists. The ability to start linking together consumer profiles such that as you hit them on their TV and their mobile and their PC, you can start to bring together this idea that this is the same person within the TV world, the same household, and start to allocate or reallocate your marketing spend accordingly. And certainly, depending on some of the size of budgets within the WFA membership, the savings or ability to redistribute and get incremental reach for the same budget is very, very significant. So on the WFA members, when we did the poll, again, talked about DMP, these data management platforms, being the buzzword of 2017, but then the focus really ought to be around this idea of internal capabilities and expertise to be able to direct that. Because the DMP in and of itself is really only it's a repository, it's a database, it's an ability to capture all of this data, but what it doesn't necessarily do is then automatically translate into value unless actions then happen about the way that data is used. And so one of the questions that came up on the poll earlier, or the webinar earlier, one of the things we're starting to see now is this idea of CDPs being ranked as higher priority technology investments, so customer data platforms. And those are typically, as the name suggests, more customer-centric rather than just about collecting swathes of data. And interestingly also more link back to more use cases that are able to make that data actionable. So one very real one for us within our Touchpoint, our demand-side platform, would be that ability to link customer data then to buying decisions in real time and really be a part of that decisioning process rather than something that sits purely in a repository for reporting. So let's have a look at exactly one of those types of use cases, and it's something that's actually on the rise with the WFA membership. We saw from the poll that 87% of marketers are now using advanced modelling techniques such as lookalike modelling, rather than necessarily just relying on some more of the black and white techniques such as audience matching or retargeting cookies that had already existed and that you had knowledge of. So this idea of lookalike modelling, for those not familiar with it, is by taking your target audiences and then really profiling those characteristics to be able to expand that and create a lookalike segment. So significantly increasing the scale of the addressable audience without compromising the factors that really drove the performance of that target audience in the first place. And this would be a very good example of a use case for both the DMP and the emerging customer data platforms, is to be able to orientate that data architecture with use cases like this in mind. How can we create something that's going to be able to get us the ability to go and take a broader audience target that still fit the profile, that ability to increase the scale of our campaigns without having to compromise that performance element. And when we looked at the extent to which people were doing this already, what we saw is that only 7% of marketers believe they've got a robust cross-device marketing strategy in place, and yet nearly 7 out of 10 see it as a big priority for this year. So what do we mean by this cross-device path-to-purchase strategy? Well, we've given you an example here using an example of Lynn, the consumer who, as you see at the bottom, the advertiser knows across a PC and a mobile device, and that publisher partners that advertiser or their agency may work with look across a few more devices, and that vendors who specialise in identity and mapping identity between different devices and cookie IDs see in different places as well. But fundamentally, nobody has this one whole view of Lynn. And if we go all the way back to the P&G CFO's point, really there's money being wasted in that frequency capping model alone in the event that you're not able to tie these profiles together. And depending on the scale of your marketing investment, that can be very, very significant. So when we talk about the 69%, it's no surprise that more and more people are looking at, and again, there are options on the market now that you can work with or that your agency can partner with in terms of being able to do a better job than has been done before in this arena. So what's going to be coming up next? And I want to focus here on formats and buying models. When we think about the future, there's a number of things that are going to be continuing. There's GDPR compliance and understanding GDPR implications, data collection and usage. We've seen the focus on measurement and different frameworks of measurement. But things that really we don't think have hit the mainstream yet, but are about to do so now, are going to be this idea of new formats. So I'm going to focus on television and the buying modes of reaching those formats. So programmatic television, as a general category, we see 86% of marketers from the research at WFA just before Christmas exploring new channels like this as a priority for 2018. And the reasons they're doing so are compelling. There is this idea of incremental reach. I'm certainly not here to say that television is dying. Television in and of itself, if you talk to traditional broadcast players, is in rude health. What we are though seeing is that a number of those consumers are viewing that content on different devices at different times, and therefore there's considerably more fragmentation, and monetizing all of that gets harder. Now actually being able to move away from traditional linear buying models into more advanced buying models allows you to recapture and gain some on those reach measures. Frequency control we've already touched upon, with this idea of being able to now, through the data that's available, not just understand an overall ratings value for a show or ad slot, but instead be able to understand who is being exposed to campaigns, which campaigns they're exposed to, and subsequently the extent to which that's working, not just over a 30-second click window, but actually over days, weeks, months, by tying data sets together, that the new infrastructure allows us, and new partners allows us to do. This idea of scale, GDPR is clearly a hurdle a number of people need to get over, and there's an amount of cost involved in that, in ensuring compliance. But actually, one of the things that I think we can really focus on here is the opportunity this gives us as well. And being able to leverage that data that you've now curated, secured, that you've ensured is privacy compliant, being able to leverage that in more and more places is clearly going to be a valuable use of the investment that people are currently making in that GDPR effort. And finally, going all the way back to the start of this presentation, this idea of measurability, the idea of being able to get to a better view of performance than things like clicks, being able to get to a better view of performance than the 30-second window allowed beforehand, and that the inability to tie together cookies or device IDs or actually consumers who are walking into showrooms or stores has ever been before, is something that we definitely believe there is a huge amount of value in for WFA members and advertisers and agencies in general moving forward. The way that that's working can really be seen most clearly in this rise of CTV, connected television. There are a number of different models which I'll touch on here, but connected TV is really around the buying of ads on over-the-top devices, so long-form content but actually being delivered through things like Chromecast, like Apple TV, like Roku, and that differs slightly from addressable TV, which is more around using data to target TV ads, or even as a first step, this idea of programmatic linear TV, being able to automate the buying of advertising across traditional TV schedules. This whole arena is growing significantly, and using dataxu numbers from the States, last year we saw over a 250% rise in CTV inventory being bought year over year, and a massive increase in the number of campaigns that being used upon, both driven by the number of advertisers who are involved and also the number of campaign schedules that now employ a degree of connected television inventory on it. Now, part of this is being driven by the supply of this available as well, and when we talk about the new buying modes, a really good example of that would be things like the European Broadcaster Exchange, which kicked off late last year and is a joint venture between a number of massive European television companies like ProSieben, like TF1, like Mediaset in Spain and Italy, and lately Channel 4 joining at the end of Q4. And what that's driving is really a lot more quality long-form content being available for buying through these new buying modes. And if we have a look at what that means for the way that advertisers are expected to respond to that, what we're seeing is that almost €1 billion is expected to be invested in 2020 in the EU5 alone in connected TV. And this is data from Spot Exchange and MTM, or MTM are a media and technology consultancy. And that is a massive growth, especially in a number of markets. Italy on a very small base so far, France significantly higher proportion growth than even we see in the UK. So what we when we have a look at this point, and it came up as a question earlier, we don't have the number of the extent to which the percentage of all inventory is connected TV or connected TV available, but what we are seeing, and only have to look at the M&A activity within the TV sector at the moment, and the reasons behind it, is that more and more of this inventory is being made available through these alternate buying models that aren't part of the traditional TV upfront that we've seen things conducted on beforehand. So let's sum up. What are the key things that we'd love you to be able to take away from this as you think about the future of programmatic within your own organisations? The first one is really around this conscious choice on the measurement of success, making sure that the metrics aren't the ones that are available, but are the ones that are meaningful for your organisations, and that your partners and implementation partners, especially the technology providers, are actually making sure that all of the right hooks are available in the way that campaigns are deployed to be able to tie that data together for meaningful performance and outcome measurement. Secondly, this idea of organising for optimal programmatic activity outcomes. Yes, in-house is rising significantly, but it's not necessarily the right model for everybody. Actually, we're seeing huge growth in the independent agency sector, and our CEO, Mike Baker, wrote just last week around the rise of the independents, and largely due to a number of the different skill sets and traits, the agility, the competencies they have, typically the independence and transparency of their models versus others, that make them very compelling options for advertisers at the moment. This point about data, we talked a lot about it on this webinar, but making sure both yours and your own partner data is GDPR compliant is fundamental to success. Whether or not we see a bump in the road after May in terms of the volumes of data available or that's being shared across the ecosystem and how that impacts programmatic remains to be seen. But we would definitely highlight that while GDPR may appear to be kind of the stick that's beating advertisers and the ecosystem at the moment, this idea that there is a bigger carrot available to those who come out the other side in terms of benefits like the savings or redistribution of marketing budget from proper frequency control is something that could make all of the effort very much worthwhile. And finally, a plea to definitely look at extending programmatic strategy to include TV. Typically, the reason we see the growth, the huge growth in the amount of campaigns using CTV is that it hasn't been a mainstream thing until now. We've put it in the future, but fundamentally, with things like the rise of EBX, with the work of Sky and other broadcasters, there's a huge amount of connected TV available supply coming onto the market. And we've already seen from the last 50, 60 years the impact television has as an advertising medium. This is a way of applying more benefits in terms of data and targeting onto an already proven effective medium in order to make it work for the brands that you represent. So we definitely think that if those four things are things that we can leave you with from this webinar, it will have been 45 minutes well spent. With that, we've reached the end of our content, so thank you very much for your attention. I'll hand back to Matt to maybe pick up on some of the questions that have come in so far.
You know, it's for many on this call, they're in global roles, right? And hence you're getting questions, we're seeing sort of questions around, you know, what percentages by market, this, that, and the other. But, you know, yeah, it's coming, but how realistic is it really? You know, do you think that brands can now begin to plan but to commit budgets towards programmatic TV in 2018, 2019, and you know, how should they approach that? How realistic is that, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there is a dependency by market, because I think some markets are more forward-thinking or have embraced this faster than others, and clearly there's only a limited number of television and broadcast companies in any given market. That said, this idea of TV content isn't just made by the broadcasters anymore. There are a number of options of long-form quality content providers out there with decent audience numbers. Now, they're not, to give people a sense, we're not getting the 20+% reach for any individual program. We're not getting the blockbuster audiences yet from those types of content providers. But we are seeing people like Sky, for example, have an advanced television division. They have a significant revenue stream off the back of that already. So, Matt, to your point about can advertisers really start doing this now? Absolutely, they can, and a number of them are, and we expect, per the forecast from Spot Exchange and NTM, we expect those numbers to grow significantly over time. We also, through the learning curve that programmatic and the automation of media buying has already been through in other channels, we'd expect this to get faster still within TV. Because fundamentally programmatic is really designed as purely automation of the things that are already happening. So I would absolutely suggest people should be looking at it very seriously. You can transact now, and when we start to look at the future, it's not that bold a prediction to talk about the majority of TV being traded in a programmatic manner, the extent to which data is overlaid on it and the extent to which it's done real time notwithstanding, but traded in a programmatic manner within the next 3 to 4 years.
Yeah, and there's obvious attractions for brand safety perspective and all of that. So yeah, kind of makes sense, doesn't it? We talk about the CDPs in there. Can you give some examples of any that you'd recommend? And should advertisers be thinking about sort of, you know, pivoting away from DMPs into a CDP? But because fewer of the CDPs I see are the sort of classic, the big names. But are there any companies that you'd specifically recommend that our clients should sort of look at?
Honestly, we've seen, so we're working with a number of them now, and there's value propositions to almost every single one of them. We haven't found a bad one yet amongst the things that we're integrating with and that are being used to activate media from advertisers' own data set. I think the one piece of advice we would definitely give is going back to that point that was made by one of the WFA members, which is it not being about technology for technology's sake. The use case and understanding and having the expertise, and this generally does need to be in-house. We talk about different programmatic models. The deployment of it's all very well, but you actually need people in-house who are well skilled and well versed in not only its collection but actually utilization and empowering the use cases you have for that data. So I think no specific recommendations on it, but only about the skill set required and making sure that if nothing else, is absolutely in-house for each advertiser.
Yeah. I mean, the next question, I can imagine the answer because it links into what you've just asked. But someone's asked, as a technology company yourself, where do you see the biggest gaps on the brand side? And thinking perhaps and into the future, where are those gaps? Is it technology and data, for example, or is it something else?
I think the biggest gap that we observe, oddly, are really, and it's one of the points that we made at the very start of this, is about choosing the programmatic model. We see far too many instances where there is a divergence between the advertiser and their agency in terms of the incentives and objectives of programmatic campaigns. And I think this is one of the reasons why we're seeing the rise of the independent ad agency more and more, is because by nature they tend to be more transparent. They don't have these conflicts of interest with their own technology stacks. And we still observe, despite the fact that there is a big shift towards the independent sector, there's not enough, I think, really challenging of group agencies going on within the big brands around the extent to which those objectives are aligned, that there is transparency of rewards and fees, and that's it's changing. Don't get me wrong. Yeah. The work that we saw after the ANA and the various catalysts you already mentioned, things like the brand safety fiascos of Q1 and Q4 last year, has definitely caused brands to lean in more across all gamuts of agency relationship. But I think that stakeholder management and goal and expectation alignment is one of the biggest gaps we observe.
Okay, interesting. Okay, last one. Try and wrap this up quickly. Here's a question: how does or doesn't GDPR impact the use of first-party data? I mean, the answer is it does, doesn't it? And I know we've spoken about this privately, but you view it as potentially cataclysmic for the future programmatic industry, and I have to agree. But yeah, I mean, first party, second party, third party, it's all affected by GDPR, isn't it?
Exactly. Every piece of data that people are ending up using should be expected to be under the remit of the GDPR framework. So the interesting part is there is all this work about readiness going on at the moment. And there is definitely a framework and a roadmap towards readiness that vendors and advertisers and data partners can all follow. Now, in the event that people, and it's probably too early to say right now, but in the event that people are getting there, then actually this may well be sort of viewed as something along the lines of like the millennium bug. A huge amount of work went into it. It wasn't the disaster that people thought it could have been. But the headline stat, and what makes me really concerned, is that 10% of people who say they're ready already is far too low. And in the event that doesn't change and go north quickly, then we will see a considerable drop in the data volumes that allow a lot of the benefits of programmatic to be realised. We'll get back to a state where actually the only benefit becomes more around either anonymous data profiling, which reduces the effectiveness of targeting, or we actually just get back to the automation of existing buying processes, which is appealing, but it only adds a few percent of efficiency and not the big gains we see already. So it could be a big deal, and we definitely want people to focus on it a lot.
Absolutely. All right, great. Well, look, thank you very much for your time, Mike, and thanks everyone for participating as well. All of this stuff is exactly the material that we discuss in our physical forums. Here's a list of what we have coming up. Not the easiest to read, apologies. But anyway, we've got a media forum next week in London, and then the week after we have one in Singapore. Media Forum is kind of the home for this kind of material. We'll be in New York in April and again in November. Anyway, this is all on our website, and you'll see communication from us about this stuff as well. So thanks again for participating, and Mike, particular thanks to you.